Hi everyone, I'm thrilled to welcome both Iona Italia and Clyde Rathbone on the podcast, so welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Vincent.
So Iona, I will start by introducing you. You are the sub-editor of Areo magazine. You also host the podcast Two for Tea, and you wrote two books, which people can check out, Anxious Employment in 2005 and Our Tango World in 2018. Clyde, you are the co-founder of Karma and then now Letter. I think you're a retired professional rugby player, if my Googling is correct.
That's correct.
You founded Letter along with your brother Dane Rathbone and Monish Barajuli. I can very briefly present Letter and then let you explain it in much more detail. So it's a website that hosts long-form conversations between people, and it encourages the participants to be open-minded, to assume good intentions of their interlocutor, and to seek out dialogue rather than debate. Is that a fair presentation?
Yeah,
I don't know which one of you would like to start.
I think you've summarized the key elements really well. The idea for Letter came from a series of interviews that Dane and I did with people that we could observe trying to have the longer form, more nuanced conversation on the existing platforms. And we asked them what their experience was like on the Twitters and Facebook of this world, and a lot of them expressed a lot of frustration. And one of the questions we asked them was what they would do if they had a magic wand and they could create an online space that encouraged thoughtful conversation. And one of the key things that emerged from those discussions was protecting the conversation but not making it entirely private. So Letter's kind of like a hybrid between email and a totally open social platform. So it's like email in the sense that you're communicating with one other person, and once the conversation is initiated, it's locked to those initial participants, but it's also open to the public to view. So there are public conversations that anyone can follow. But what's, I think, crucially different is that once the conversation is underway, the audience can't interject into that conversation. And that tends to be the problem with a lot of the other places, is that uninvited individuals can insert themselves into a dialogue and then often derails it. Iona, do you have any comments?
No, I don't have anything to add.
So I guess the platform launched in early 2019. We now feature a host of conversations ranging on all kinds of topics, from very academic, intellectual exploration between two interlocutors through to very practical, everyday conversations on things like parenting and nutrition and so on. And it's been exciting to watch the platform produce new kinds of conversations that I think are quite rare online.
And do you have any idea about the numbers? How many conversations have taken place? How many people are reading them, etc.?
Yeah, we have a roughly 2,000 readers per week. We're growing at around 14% per week on our active writers, and that's the thing that we track as our most important metric. This is probably not that interesting to most people, but in the startup world, these metrics are really important. So since we've launched, we've been growing at 14% week over week in the number of active writers. We had something like 23 writers last week, and at our current growth rate, we'll be hitting something like 26 next week, and then 30 and so on. So I think the interesting thing about the platform is that once people write a letter, they tend to stick around. 89% of all the new letters written on the platform are written by someone who's already written a letter. So there's a very high level of re-engagement. And I think that speaks to how much enjoyment people are getting from these conversations. I think there was a real desire for something like Letter, and that's why we're seeing people come across from Twitter and Facebook, and where I think a lot of the conversations get started, but then they're really fleshing them out on our platform.
And typically, how long do these conversations last? How many messages do people send back and forth? How long do they keep the conversation alive?
So the average person writes roughly 4 letters in a conversation. The interesting thing is there's a huge variance here. So I think the data set is quite small still for us to be able to say what the hard numbers are. But we have exchanges that are into the 50th letter now.
Wow.
Here, someone like Matt McManus, who you can find on Letter, and these are just prolific writers who like to go deep on subject matters, and the conversations are just bursting out of people. But then other letters might just be an exchange of, say, 4 or 5 per writer. What some of our writers are doing are meeting offline, or rather on email, to outline some ground rules for the conversation. So they might decide who will take the first letter, who will have the final word, and how many letters each of them will write. And other people are just diving in, figuring it out as they go. So
Okay, and for the people who just happen to read these conversations, so you've mentioned that it's not possible for them to just insert themselves in the debate and possibly derail it, as you mentioned. How can they engage with what's said in the letters?
often people are sharing their letters to Twitter and Facebook and even Reddit. And in a sense, we've outsourced the comments section of our platform to Twitter. So people can still get feedback on their letters and kind of find out what the crowd thinks of their writing. And I think that's important, but I also think it's important that we keep letter as minimalist, non-distracting as possible. There's a real sense. I know I feel when I'm on something like Twitter that you are playing to a crowd to some extent, and it can kind of induce this performative element that I think is unhelpful to conversation. On letter, you do have this feeling that you're conversing with another person, and we're ensure that the platform is as clean and minimalist as possible, and I think that's important.
And what's been the feedback so far from people who took part in these conversations? I'm sure you've heard from at least some of them. What are they telling you about their experience?
Yeah, that's been really eye-opening, how much people enjoy being in a thoughtful conversation. I think when you contrast that with how we spend time online on the other spaces, it's pretty chaotic and fast-paced and short form and like soundbite style communication. And I think long, deep conversation is such a natural way to learn and to explore something that our goal really is to give people a first experience of that. Because the feedback has just been tremendous. You couldn't write better endorsements of the platform than what we receive, and that's hugely encouraging. But I guess the challenge now is to give more and more people these experiences and bring them onto the platform.
So Iona, you haven't participated much so far. Would you like to add something regarding these various points?
I think so. When I'm writing an article, that always feels like a huge hurdle to leap over. I enjoy writing, but I always quite hard because I feel as though in an article I have to marshal all my thoughts at once. I have to get all of my arguments watertight. It has to be all perfect on the first go and then ready to put out there. And I always end up procrastinating, and then my article is late, and then I feel even more that it must be some immense, amazing magnum opus to make up for its tardiness. And so I get into this kind of vicious cycle. And letter is really a nice way to explore your thoughts without that kind of pressure of having to produce this giant polished thing. You don't have to say everything at once. You can just put out some initial salvos, and you know that somebody at the other end is there waiting to hear from you and to read, because otherwise writing is always this great leap of faith. There's a proverb about teaching which I think also applies to this. It's said to be ye olde Chinese proverb. It's probably apocryphal. I don't know what the source is, but they say that when you're a teacher, you stand up there and you open up a vein. And some people will catch your blood with thimbles. Some people will catch your blood with buckets. And others will just stand and watch you bleed. And that's the feeling when you are writing something. I feel when I'm writing an article or a long Facebook status, it's a message going out there into the void, and I don't know if people are reading. I don't know if they are responding. I have no idea how my words are coming across. And on Twitter in particular, people often like and they share, but they don't actually read. And so this kind of feeling of being read, I think, is super important. We have so many platforms at the moment where people are writing and putting their words out there, in all of our digital magazines, in blogs, on their Facebook statuses, on their Twitter feeds, on their Twitter threads. Even on Twitter, you see that you write a thread and people will ask questions that you all answered 3 tweets later. And it's the shortest piece of writing possible, but even that hasn't been read. So this kind of sensation of expressing yourself, being read and heard and responded to, and then you having to read what are the response and respond to that is just I feel it's something that is really missing in our discourse at the moment, and it's very important.
Okay, so to both of you, I can ask what are the topics of the conversations you've had on Letter so far?
There's a huge array, as I said. We have relatively.
But I meant personally, you've taken part, right? Yeah.
I'll let Iona go because she's just the most prolific letter writer, I think, on the platform.
I'm gonna
Wow,
I'm
okay.
gonna find my account and just
Okay.
look and
I'll
remind
just
myself.
pick up on something that Iona said. I think she really highlighted, I think, which is the key insight that I think Letter has discovered or stumbled upon, and that is that the other platforms tend to overvalue monologue. They undervalue dialogue. So even when you're using them, there is the sense that you're shouting out into the void or that you're performing to the crowd, and it's quite rare to feel like you're actually connecting with someone else. And that we think that is when the internet is at its best, when it's genuinely connecting people and guiding them to what's true. So I love what she said there. And the other point that she reminded me of is just the difference between writing something from scratch and being in conversation. This is the best I think to think about is that it's kind of like the difference between being asked to give a keynote speech versus to just do a Q&A. And a lot of people have said that to us, is that just the conversation flows much more naturally. Iona, have you got your...
Very nice.
Yes, I'm sorry. I've reached the age at this stage where I keep my brain very list and I try to put as many things as possible in a different space, like in a notebook or online, because it's getting to be a kind of crowded, dusty old lumber room in there, and it's hard to locate things. The exchanges I've had have varied a lot. I've had some very extremely personal conversations. So to Victor Rivera, I talked about how to restart your life. If you feel that your life has got derailed or you've allowed it to get derailed, I'm a radical non-believer in free will, so I'm going to just say our life has got derailed, out of control. How do you restart things? And Victor, who used to be a drug addict, was a good person to have this conversation with. How do you let go of regrets for things that you've done wrong in the past and begin afresh? And I talked to Gurwinder Bhugal. I talked about early childhood memories and the nature of memory, how much of what you remember really happened and how much of it is stories that you are telling yourselves. And Clyde and I, we talked about belonging and having a feeling of community and the difficulties in finding that kind of community feeling. So all of those exchanges were extremely personal. I had 2 letter exchanges with Daniel Sharp that were, one was about the Enlightenment, and we were talking about how we would both summarize what the most important developments were in that period, which was my area of expertise as an academic. And Daniel and I also talked about the Iraq War. So we both seem to be the only people in the world who supported and who still justify the Iraq War. We talked about why.
There is, along with Hitchens.
Yes, exactly. Hitchens and Nick Cohen. We're the 4. Well, Hitchens is dead now. Nick Cohen and Daniel and I are the only 3 people who still feel this way. And I talked to Visakan Veerasamy, who is in Singapore. We talked about caste in the Indian diaspora in Singapore, and we compared experiences, my experiences in India and his experiences as an Indian growing up in Singapore. I talked to Josh Uter. So Rabbi Josh Uter has had 2 conversations on our site, completely contrasting. So one is with medical ethicist Brian Earp, and they are talking about circumcision, which is obviously, it's a delicate thing to tell a rabbi that you believe circumcision is something that should be practice that should be completely discontinued. So he's an Orthodox rabbi, lives in Israel, Josh. And Josh and I, however, are talking about the 90s sci-fi series Babylon 5, of which we are both devotees.
Okay.
And I've had conversations about education and academia, about the impact of Wikipedia on people's research practices, about what my favorite books and literature are and how to encourage people to read more, about the post-racial idea and retiring from being right. Being white. I never retire from being right. I will always be right. But and I've talked about freedom of speech. I've had a letter exchange on abortion rights and one about Islam. And I also kind of interviewed Cody Moder, the anthropologist Cody Moser, about why he chose anthropology as a career. Had an exchange about that. There have been a few more as well, but those are the ones we'll talk about now. That's enough, I think.
All right, that's a good start.
My first conversation was probably the most interesting, mainly because it just highlighted the kinds of progress that can be made with this medium of communication. So it was with a friend of mine, Mike Naina. It was, I think, Letter had only been launched for a few days, and ours was the first conversation on the platform. And what was really interesting about it was that it was a conversation we've been having for years. Mike lives in Melbourne. I'm in Canberra. They're about 600 kilometers apart. We would see each other a handful of times every year, and it seemed to me that we were essentially rehashing the same conversation every time we would come together, significant headway. So we thought we'd try this as an experiment and to kind of validate two things. One is, can we do better in writing than we've been doing verbally? And is it enjoyable? Is it something that we would actually like to do? So we almost ran an N of 1 on ourselves, or N of 2, to see if this was worth rolling out beyond that small group. And I remember starting the conversation and really being completely distracted from my real work that day and just wanting to go further with it. And that was extremely eye-opening. The conversation was about religion. But the thing that was interesting to me was less the content of what we were discussing and more just the realization that there was something incredibly valuable in this mode of communication and something that I hadn't done really ever. I had some email exchanges with people, but never really decided to stick to one thing and go deep and to really push myself to be open to a different perspective. I think we like to feel as though we are, but I only speak from my own experience. I think we do much worse than we expect in that regard. And it is uncomfortable to have one of your more cherished opinions threatened, and to feel a bit less confident than you did going in. But it's also extremely rewarding, or to feel the converse, which is to feel more confident in your opinion because it's been stress tested. So that first conversation was eye-opening, and then since then I've had a conversation about free speech with a former teammate of mine. I've had a conversation about the ethics and incentives relating to Letter. How do we build a platform that doesn't repeat the mistakes of the others? How do we make sure that there's a strong alignment between the values of the platform and of its users? So yeah, those are an example of some of the things I've discussed on Letter, and I wish I had more time. Building a company is just endlessly time-consuming and stressful. But I know when I do go back and write, it's an extremely rewarding half an hour on Letter as a reader or a writer versus half an hour on any other platform. I'm obviously biased, but it does seem like the quality of that time is just much higher.
Okay. Do people who have these conversations always or almost always start with disagreeing points of view, or is it not so systematically the case.
I know you can comment on this if you'd like, but there are other conversations between people who, are having a strict dialectic. It's two people who disagree but are collaborating through disagreement to try and figure out what is true. So there's a lot of those conversations. Then there are also lots of conversations that are more representative of, I guess, an old school letter exchange. It's an exploration of another person in their life. And we're also starting to see more sort of didactic style conversations, a domain expert helping to educate someone who's interested in that subject matter. So there's a wide range.
Mm-hmm.
And I am similar to Iona in that I do tend to be most attracted to the dialectic. There's something very interesting about seeing two opposing views in parallel and watching the conversation unfold. And so that's what I enjoy reading on letter. But there's something for everyone in there, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I enjoy reading the conversations that begin with disagreement, but I don't enjoy writing to someone who disagrees with me on the whole. I avoid arguing with people, and I prefer exploring a subject together with someone who I already kind of agree with, but I want to go deeper into their views. So I'm planning to use it more in future as a kind of interview, a sort of something a little more two-way than an interview. Like the kinds of interviews that Sam Harris does in his podcast, where he's also quite opinionated and has a lot to say, because it's impossible for me to not have a lot to say myself on any topic. I'm an extremely opinionated person. But I would like to do more interviews on the platform, written interviews where I'm really someone whose ideas intrigues me and who seems like-minded. I want to go deeper into things with them. And I'm starting that with a letter exchange. I'm starting today with Thomas Chatterton Williams. That's going to be my first foray into this mode. I have noticed something interesting. People interaction are way more introspective than I usually see when people are disagreeing. Usually when I see people disagreeing on Twitter or on Facebook, or even in comments on an article, it's I think X, you think Y. And so we disagree. And there's no exploration of, well, why is it that I think X? What is it that made me, for example, I support Bernie Sanders, which is true, actually. I do support him. So why do I support Bernie Sanders? What is it about my personality and my personal history that has made me drawn to kind of leftist politics? Why does Bernie appeal to me? So in an article I've just been writing about this, I'm calling it epistemological memoirs, or epistemological kind of personal history. So epistemology is that posh term for how you know what you know. So how do I know that I like Bernie? Why do I like Bernie? It's a different question from I like Bernie, you don't like him, therefore we can argue about the Bernie platform. And I see a ton of people doing this kind of introspection on letter, quite unprompted by the correspondent. But something about the form seems to encourage people to do that deeper exploration. So they're like, well, the reason I got into libertarianism and became a libertarian was this is what happened, and this is how my ideas evolved. And that personalization makes it much easier to get a better understanding of the other person's point of view. You can trace back how their views evolved. And so it doesn't seem like here are the good ideas here and the bad ideas here, and we will fight it out. But it's like, why do I believe these things? What is that? What has my train of thought been? And what has your train of thought been? And when you start approaching things that way, it's much easier to find common ground. And even if you don't end up agreeing in any way, you end up, it's a kind of anti-dehumanization. You end up like rehumanizing the other person. Even if you still completely disagree with them, it's not even about coming to an agreement. It's about coming to a kind of deeper understanding of the variety of humanity and human attitudes and views that are out there.
Yeah, I completely agree. When people disagree on, say, something like Twitter, they so often get combative And when they disagree on letter, they collaborate. I think part of that has to do with the fact that when they arrive on the platform for the first time, they can see conversations that model that kind of good faith that you alluded to. And it's that initial exposure that I think does kind of set the tone for how people engage with the platform. It's why there are vastly different cultures on various online platforms. It's why Twitter is different from LinkedIn and LinkedIn is different from YouTube. And what we were very conscious of was embedding a shortlist of very high quality, good faith engagements on the platform early on. And Iona was central to that, along with a few of our early adopters, and really just modeling the kinds of engagements we wanted to see more of. And I think that has helped kind of set the trajectory for the other content that we've been able to feature. You kind of touched on something, Iona, which made me think about free will. We talked about this kind of anti-dehumanization element, as if you can understand all the dominoes that led to a particular view, then you can empathize much more deeply with them. And I think this is, exploring a person's history and exploring your own does allow you to have a kind of view of ideas that may have made you recoil in the past. And even if you disagree, you can disagree in much better faith.
I should say that there are some conversations also on here that are not personal. We have a few philosopher couples, partnership or whatever, happening on here. And I think there's one with Aaron Rubinovitz in particular. His letter is like, okay, this is my view of free will. Let me outline it in 6 points. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Kindly give me your rebuttals. So not all the lectures have this very touchy thing. It's just really surprising to me. And that's okay. I mean, these are also conversations that people want to have. And the idea is that you can have whatever type of conversation you want to have on this platform. If you want to be two complete wankers and just like shout at each other, you can do that on here as well. It's up to you. But the platform seems to weight incentives in specific direction, which it's very subtle because you just have a text box there and you can put whatever you like in that text box. But somehow the whole kind of exchange setup seems to nudge people in the direction of greater introspection, thoughtfulness, charitableness, even though we're not doing anything to nudge them. It's just this form of conversation is there.
So Letter tries to act as a counterweight to political polarization, which we might see elsewhere. And there's always this question about this very point, which is, to what extent does this polarization really happen? Is it something that we perceive because maybe we're on Twitter and we see the most polarized space with the most polarized people, so to say? Does it happen beyond these maybe specific platforms is a question that I often ask myself, and I wonder what you're thinking about this.
Yeah, I mean, I think Twitter is obviously a amplified version of human disagreement, amongst other things. But I do think that they are highlighting real world divisions. We can talk about America and the Trump election, Brexit. These are real events that I think highlight the kinds of divisions that when in the post-internet world, I think a lot of people didn't expect. I think there was an expectation that when we were hyper-connected and we could communicate through, when geography was no longer a boundary, that there would be a kind of convergence around our values and our approaches to significant problems, and that has happened to some extent, but it's easier now more than ever to create echo chambers. It doesn't matter how beyond the pale your view is, you can find support for it on the internet, and
yes,
these are real problems.
Yeah, that's a strong point. There is this French sociologist who specialized in the sociology of beliefs and extreme beliefs and what the internet allows in this respect. And he has this nice analogy where we evolved in very tough situations. We barely had enough to eat if we did, and so we tend to crave the fatty foods and the sweet foods. But now in our age of abundance, of course, we should be careful not to consume too much of these. And so there is sort of a mismatch between the evolutionary pulsions and the circumstances. And similarly, he argues that we evolved to favor very fast and frugal, as they are sometimes called, fast and frugal heuristics, like very easy and maybe lazy ways of coming to beliefs. And we sort of favor the dramatic and the scandalous over the boring and the factual. And the internet is, well, can be used to play to these instincts. And as you just said, once you have this way of exchanging ideas, even if you have, or if you're drawn to very a priori extreme beliefs, you will always, find a way to defend them. And if the information is everywhere, you will always find a tiny nugget of information to defend even the craziest things. So there is this mechanism that causes or that allows even crazy beliefs to receive some amount of at least superficial justification. Yeah, Iona, I should let you speak on this issue if you would like.
Yeah. Well, I feel that a couple of things are going on. One is that I think Facebook is much worse than Twitter in this regard. And
Mm-hmm.
Facebook really, I think, illustrates very clearly the two extremes that are happening. And
Mm-hmm.
because on Facebook, people tend to have a large proportion of their Facebook friends tend to be people that they have met in real life, who are
Mm-hmm.
their real life friends, acquaintances, and family tend to be also on Facebook. Um, and what happens on Facebook is one of two things. People feel strongly about things, but they don't feel safe posting about them
Mm-hmm.
or responding to posts about them, and so they're kind of just avoiding big major subjects. I mean, it's fine if you're not really that interested in politics or other polarizing things. That I completely understand. Then you're not avoiding the topic, you're just choosing not to discourse about that. But I certainly have friends
Mm-hmm.
who feel really strongly, but their relationships with other people on Facebook are rather superficial because they don't touch any of the things that mean the most to them, in fact. But when you do post about those topics, then it can get so bitter and angry so quickly. We're coming up for our presidential election is on Sunday here in Argentina, and it's just people's friendships are breaking up over Facebook posts. Right now, I can see this happening. It's just it makes the American politics look like a kumbaya kind of party
Wow,
picnic.
it's hard to
I tell
imagine,
you
but
that
wow.
it's really really bitter, really entrenched and bitter
Mm-hmm.
here. I think that it's what we need is a way to be able to talk to each other about things that we feel strongly about without it instantly escalating. It escalates so fast on Facebook and on Twitter, even faster, without it instantly escalating into a flame war and damaging people's personal relationship. But the kind of kumbaya thing of, well, we're just not going to discuss this ever so we can stay friends is a little bit unsatisfying to me as well. And so a lot of people on the social justice left, I hear them saying that they're skeptical of the idea of letter
Mm-hmm.
because they think it's forcing yourself to be polite and nice to people who you think don't deserve that. And I kind of understand that because what they think is that it's like the Facebook thing of just only posting puppy videos because you don't want to get into a fight,
Mm-hmm.
which is valid. I'm not saying everybody should be in the sparring ring all the time, but
Right.
I think they misunderstand, which is that we're looking for this sweet spot between these things. These are the things we just don't talk about. And we talk about them, and there's instant explosion. In a sense, those are both forms of avoidance. If I never talk to you about it, and if I snark at you on Twitter and then block you, those are both forms of avoidance, the kind of
Mm-hmm.
points of friction.
Yeah.
And I feel like we need to have a way to be able to go to those places and stay there comfortably,
Sure.
talking to each other rather than just like shouting past each other, which happens on Twitter too. You write something and I quote tweet it on my wall. So I'm not even directly engaging you. I'm like displaying your view and putting my own view, and all of my followers are agreeing with me. Then you quote tweet me and you're like, look at what a total pillock Iona is, and all your followers agreeing with you. And then I'm like, Vincent is a wank stain. Look at what he said, and all my followers agreeing with me. Oh, sorry, I don't know if you're allowed to swear on this podcast, and I have just sworn. So
That
I'm
is
so
your
sorry.
official title, I'm assuming, Vincent.
But
I didn't know this swear word, I must say, but yeah.
maybe you can bleep it out or something.
It's fine. No, it's not a problem at all.
But we're not actually really talking to each other. It's just like a drive-by shooting, and we actually need to get down and have Brazilian jiu-jitsu instead of like shooting each other from speeding cars.
Sorry, Iona, I cut you off.
No, I'm finished actually.
Yeah,
I'm
I really
done.
I love what you said there, and I think part of the reason that letter writing does mitigate some of these problems is that the conversation has breathing room. You have to spend time fleshing out your letter, and then you publish it, and the other person can sit on that letter for as long as they like. So there's not this pressure to immediately fire something back that I think is felt on the other platform. So whilst you're at the height, whatever emotional peak you're experiencing, usually it's some sort of outrage or anger. That's not the mode that you're in when you're writing a long form letter. Even if you want it to be, you still have to wait for the other person's letter. It kind of reflects, I think, how letter exchanges would have evolved pre-internet. When you wrote a letter and you actually posted it somewhere, if there wasn't at least some level of civility in your writing, you wouldn't expect to reply. So I think it kind of enforced certain norms that are now so easy to ignore. So I think the longer form nature of the communication does tend to foster more productive discussion, and I think people naturally connect with us when they have one of these types of conversations. One of the things that we discussed really on with Letter was that really all we are doing is trying to mimic the conventions that tend to protect conversation in the real world, but on an online space. Imagine if we behaved or people behaved in the real world like they did on Twitter, constantly interjecting yourself into conversations, walking past the conversation, then butting in, or going to see two speakers live at an event. If I start interrupting two speakers on stage, security will escort me out the building. And it's the simplicity of letter as it exists now that I think is what's driving the quality of the.
So I'm being mindful of your time, Clyde. I think maybe if that's okay with you, we can end on somewhat nicer words for social media. We've been quite hard on them. I mean, justifiably so, I should say. But maybe you've seen this study that came out a few days ago that was saying that researchers haven't found a negative impact on mental health of social media use. It doesn't mean that, social media is a good place to have like interesting conversations, but it's not so bad that it degrades people's mental health, it seems.
Yeah, I mean, I think that these technologies are incredibly powerful. I think that the ability, I mean, we take it for granted now, but the ability to communicate with people from any part of the world is just mind-boggling, mind-bogglingly powerful, and we should respect it and use it in as intelligent ways as we can imagine. And I think that's what Letter is attempting to do. It's harnessing the best parts of social media, but plugging it into a way of communicating that is far more productive.
I think it's a way of having those kind of in-depth conversations. So both not kind of sliding past each other, but really confronting the core issues. And those needn't be about political disagreements. And I personally am more interested in exploring emotional vulnerabilities and personal vulnerabilities. And I feel as though letter provides a kind of safer. I also do that on Twitter and Facebook. I try to have this radical honesty because I think it's vital if you're a writer, it's vital to peel off the top layer of your skin and expose everything. That's part of the service you do humanity, is you say the things other people are thinking and feeling, but they don't have the courage to say. You offer that to them like a gift. Somebody else also feels this way, so you can feel less angry, frustrated, worried about yourself. Someone else also has this feeling. So I tend to put that out there a lot, but I think for most people that's quite difficult, but it's a very extremely healing thing to do. And it's much easier and more rewarding in some ways to do that when you have someone, you have a specific person and you have a name and a face in mind, who is listening. The
Well
gold,
said.
yeah, that's my feeling. The gold standard is having these conversations in real life in a sense that is the most personally fulfilling. But in real life, the conversations remain between only two people. So there is also a lot of value in having access to like-minded people who are not local. Can be really wonderful. People are not interchangeable. So locally, you may not have anybody as wonderful as, say, Thomas Chatterton Williams is an extremely wonderful person, and I'm really looking forward to writing to him. And he lives in 8,000 miles away, so otherwise I would not. But also, there's a benefit to having those conversations be put out publicly, to modeling that.
Yeah, I'll just finish with a point that kind of follows on from what Iona said, which is that, one of the reasons we were motivated to build Letter was because we had reached out to people that I guess could be called public intellectuals and via email. And the thing that struck me was how often they would reply and how generous their replies were. And it just immediately occurred to us that there must be millions of other people with similar questions. And right now, the only person benefiting from this email exchange is me as the reader. And I suppose there's some benefit in educating someone. At least there's a sense of reward there. But it's just crazy to close that amount of value off from the world and make it private. So that was a huge part of why we founded the company.
Very nice. Yeah. Is there something else you would like to add, Iona, for as a closing statement, so to say?
Yeah, I really do think so. Samuel Johnson remarked this back in the mid-18th century, that we're living in an age of authors and every man must be content to be his own reader. And I feel that's probably one of the things that's most kind of at the heart of this, which is that we have tons of platforms for kind of one-way communication, and we need more two-way communication. And we'd benefit from that both intellectually. It's much easier to learn from. You can learn much more potentially from a conversation between two academics in the field than you can from reading one book or the other book. If you're not an expert, you read the book sounds very convincing and you're just kind of carried along with it because you don't know what the counter arguments are. And so the ideas are not stress tested. This is the problem with autodidacticism and the kind of limitations that it has. And people now think you can become well informed just by reading a lot. Well, not really. You have to read, and then also the ideas must be stress tested. And the kind of conversation is a good way of doing that. That, and I think this idea that we are a resource for each other, and it's not all people, each person blasting out their material, trying to get attention, trying to kind of build their brand. It's talking and being listened to and having to reply and respond. And the thing that letter writing forces you to do is to have to bear your reader in mind and also respond back to what they're saying. And it's this two-way thing which is somewhat lacking in the public sphere of discourse.
Very nice. So thanks again to the both of you for coming on the podcast for a very nice discussion. It will make people interested in the platform, I'm pretty sure. It certainly makes me even more interested in spending more time on it.
Thank you. Thanks for having us on.
Thank you, Vincent. It's been a pleasure to talk to you.
Likewise. Thank you for listening to Liberté Académique. We are a science, critical thinking, and freedom podcast. We interview researchers, teachers, and authors who have interesting ideas and who defend free, rational, evidence-based thought. We oppose as best we can a sort of anti-intellectualism coming from a section of the intellectual class. We carry out interviews in English and in French. You can find all our episodes on YouTube and on SoundCloud, as well as on the main podcasting platforms such as iTunes, Stitcher, and several others. We are also present on Twitter at @AcadFreedom and also on Facebook.